Hello and welcome to The Debate. I'm Kavita Wade. The hunger strike on Guantanamo Bay is approaching its critical third month. With his renewed vow to close the prison, will U.S. President Barack Obama actually follow through this time? In this debate, we'll look at the controversial Guantanamo prison, where currently there are over 100 detainees dying from a hunger strike, prompting doctors to force feed them, a move deemed illegal by the UN. We'll also ask why some of the detainees are given indefinite detention and not a fair trial, and what hurdles Obama faces in trying to close down the prison.
There are 166 detainees at the U.S.-run Guantanamo Bay prison in Cuba. Sources are putting the number of hunger strikers there at more than 100. Nearly 24 of those detainees are being force-fed, receiving daily nutrition through a hose inserted up their noses, down their throats, and into their stomachs like this man is demonstrating here. The United Nations Human Rights Office has condemned force-feeding of hunger strikers, saying it's equal to torture and violates international law.
The actual process of force feeding is essentially a form of torture in and of itself. The head of the American Medical Association came out recently and said that it is a really extremely painful process.
The hunger strike is now into its 12th week and has increased pressure on Washington to close down the prison. The public outcry against the desperation of Gitmo detainees has piled the pressure on U.S. President Barack Obama to close the prison. And now he's renewed a first-term pledge to shut the prison down.
It lessens cooperation with our allies on counterterrorism efforts. It is a recruitment tool for extremists. It needs to be closed.
Concerns over the prisoners' worsening health are sharply rising, encouraging activists to petition the White House to keep its promise of shutting down the prison. Activist group Code Pink has started a campaign called Fast for Gitmo. Code Pink members will fast for 24 hours on rotation. The group is also asking people from around the world to fast and send in pictures in solidarity with Guantanamo Bay prisoners. The movement has already received hundreds of positive responses from around the world.
Out of the 166 prisoners held at Guantanamo, many of them have been there for almost 11 years without any sort of charge, and 86 of them are actually cleared for release. And so desperate times calls for desperate measures. These men are being held in inhumane conditions.
The crisis at Guantanamo Bay prison increases daily, and doctors are at a crossroads. They are sworn by oath to alleviate pain and suffering, but force-feeding an individual through a feeding tube perpetuates just that. The suspicious death of an American lawyer representing Gitmo detainees is complicating the situation. The body of 38-year-old U.S. federal public defender Andy Hart was found last week with an alleged self-inflicted gunshot wound. Colin Campbell, Press TV, Washington.
Well, let me introduce our guests for this edition of The Debate. We have former U.S. diplomat George Lambrakis, who joins us from London. George Lambrakis, welcome. Let me get an idea from you first. What do you think about Guantanamo prison in terms of its overall conception and it's still being open after 11 years?
Well, it served its purpose for a time, but it has not served its purpose for many years now. You have mentioned already that in what came earlier, that President Obama has wanted to close it from the very beginning. He's been promising this, but he was stopped by a number of things. The most important being that Americans, through their Congress, have refused to take any of these prisoners into a prison in the United States, which would be, of course, the logical thing to do when you want to close it up in Guantanamo. Now, there are special courts where some of these people have been tried, where more could be tried, and where a decision could be made whether they would go to prison in America or be released to some country, preferably a country where there won't be any torture or death when they get there, and preferably a country which has enough control of its landmass, as some don't. Yemen is a good example, where if you were to release them, the government could not guarantee that they would not simply go back again to doing what they were doing before. However, given the values that we treasure in America, it is a very, very difficult and ugly situation. force feeding can be painful, but the alternative is what? It's to let people kill themselves. Well, suicide is not exactly what we want to see happening in jails either. So this is pressure on the U.S. government, and I'm sure that's part of the reason why Obama feels it's worth trying to do this again, to get the Congress to change its mind. And I think also it's time that the Defense Department and others in America made an effort to get those who are ready for release released and find the place to release them to.
I'd like to hone in on...
I think that's about all you can see.
Well, I think there's more that we can see, and we're going to try to open those topics and see what you think about that, George Lambrakis. Let me introduce Sarah Flounders. She's the co-director of International Action Center, who joins us from New York. Sarah Flounders, we're looking at Guantanamo Bay approaching the 11th year here, and we're looking at this dire situation regarding the hunger strikers. On the idea of force feeding, the UN has come out and said that's illegal. Do they have a point?
Well, everything about Guantanamo is illegal, and the previous commentator saying it served its purpose at the time. We should just be clear that by the U.S. own estimates, 92% of all the prisoners at Guantanamo had no connection to al-Qaeda at all. In other words, they were simply paid and shipped there for paid bounties. It's also important to know that Guantanamo is just the tip of the iceberg. By a UN report in 2010, there are more than 27,000 prisoners held in secret detention around the world, more than 100 U.S. Secret prisons. So Guantanamo is one part of it. The prisoners there who are on a hunger strike because they have been promised release, more than half of them were due for release, and that was years past. So every step of how the prisoners were treated at Guantanamo, how prisoners are held in secret prisons around the world. We should remember at Guantanamo, one of the prisoners, again by U.S. own records, was waterboarded 183 times. So there's torture that has gone on. There's outrageous treatment of these prisoners, and the force feeding, itself a form of torture, shows that that policy is continuing.